The night outside my car was a blur of sterile suburban streetlights, each one a silent witness to the woman I was becoming. But inside, the storm was just beginning to quiet. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from the memory of a touch so commanding it had unraveled me completely. My body was a humming archive of sensations I thought had died years ago. The faint, pleasurable ache between my thighs, the ghost of his fingers tracing my spine, the lingering scent of old books and his skin on my clothes. It was the scent of transgression, the perfume of a sin I had invited with open arms. I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror, and for a terrifying moment, a stranger stared back. Her lips were swollen, her eyes held a darkness, a knowledge they hadn't possessed when she'd left home that afternoon under the guise of a late grocery run. Home. The word itself felt foreign. Home was Mark, my husband, likely asleep in front of the television, a good man whose touch had become a predictable, passionless routine. Home was Lily, my daughter, my beautiful, innocent daughter, asleep in her room, dreaming of things that didn't involve her mother, surrendering herself on the floor of her English teacher's apartment. Oh God. Julian, Mr. Croft. The name was a whisper and a prayer on my lips. It had started with a conversation about Lily's poetry, and had ended with my own poetry being written across his skin, with my muffled cries against his shoulder as he took me. His apartment wasn't a den of seduction, it was a quiet sanctuary of literature and quiet thoughts, which only made our frantic, desperate coupling feel more profound, more earth-shattering. He hadn't just seen my body, he had seen me, Eleanor, the woman who had slowly vanished inside the roles of wife and mother. He had looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw a reflection of a woman I desperately wanted to be. Desired, alive, and utterly consumed. Driving toward the manicured lawn and the dark windows of my house, I knew I was driving back to a lie. The woman who had left this morning was gone forever, and this new creature, thrumming with a dangerous, ecstatic life, was a secret I would have to carry in the lonely silence of my perfect, hollow life. The affair had just begun, but I was already addicted to its poison. It all began in the suffocating quiet of a late autumn afternoon, in the one place my life was supposed to be completely defined by my role as a mother, my daughter's high school. The hallways smelled of floor wax, pencil shavings, and the faint, lingering scent of teenage apathy. I had been moving through a series of beige-colored classrooms for parent-teacher conferences, each one a 15-minute slot of polite nods and discussions about metrics, participation, and potential. It was a ritual of modern motherhood, necessary and soul-crushingly dull. By the time I reached the final name on my list, Mr. Julian Croft, English literature, I was on autopilot, a well-rehearsed smile fixed on my face, ready to perform my part as the concerned, engaged parent. I expected more of the same. I expected pie charts and platitudes. I was not prepared for him. His classroom was different. While the others were sterile and orderly, his felt lived in, a comfortable chaos of thought. Books weren't just on shelves. They were in precarious stacks on his desk, on the windowsills, on an empty chair. Student artwork, vibrant and messy, was taped to the walls alongside posters of long-dead poets with wild, intense eyes. On the blackboard, in a sweeping, elegant script, was a line from Walt Whitman. I am large, I contain multitudes. I felt an odd, immediate kinship with the room, a sense of sanctuary that I hadn't felt anywhere else. And then he stood up from behind his desk. He wasn't what I expected. The other male teachers were either past their prime or too young, still buzzing with a collegiate energy. Julian Croft was somewhere in the middle, a man who had settled into himself. I placed him in his early 30s. He wore a simple button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and dark trousers that had a slight, academic rumple to them. But it was his eyes that held me. They were a deep, thoughtful hazel, and they held a quiet, weary intelligence, as if he'd read every book in the room and found them all wanting. "Mrs. Henderson," he asked, and his voice was a low, calm timbre that seemed to absorb the sterile silence of the hallway outside. "Please, come in." He didn't offer a perfunctory handshake across the desk. Instead, he came around it, gesturing to the chair opposite his. The small act of closing the distance felt significant, less like a formal meeting and more like a conversation. I sat, smoothing my skirt over my knees, suddenly feeling overdressed in my sensible blazer. He began, as expected, with Lily's grades. They were excellent. He praised her work ethic, her punctuality. I nodded along, my script ready. "We're very proud of her," I said, the royal we a familiar shield that included Mark, a husband who likely hadn't read one of Lily's essays since middle school. But then, Julian leaned forward, and the conversation shifted entirely. He pushed aside the grade book. "Her grades are the least interesting thing about your daughter," he said, his gaze direct and serious. "She has a voice, a real one." He picked up a sheaf of papers from his desk, and I saw Lily's familiar handwriting. "We've been reading Dickinson. I asked them to write about a private hope. Most kids write about getting into college or buying a car. Lily," he paused, searching for the page. "Lily wrote about the feeling of wanting to be known, truly known, for who you are when no one else is looking." He looked up from the paper, and his eyes met mine. It was insightful, heartbreakingly so. "She has a profound sensitivity, an old soul." No teacher had ever spoken of my daughter this way. They spoke of her as a data point, a success story for their teaching methods. Julian spoke of her as a person, a complex human being with an inner world he was privileged to glimpse. I was so taken aback I could only manage a quiet, "Thank you." I felt a swell of pride, but something else too, a strange sort of envy. He saw a part of my daughter that I, in my haze of daily routines and domestic duties, had perhaps started to overlook. "She gets that from you, I imagine," he said softly, placing the essay back on his desk. "The eye for detail, for the things unspoken." His gaze dropped from my eyes for just a second, down to the collar of my blazer. I instinctively reached up, thinking a stray hair was out of place. "That's a beautiful piece," he said, his focus on the small silver brooch I wore. It was a vintage piece, shaped like a tiny, intricate leaf, a silly little thing I'd pinned on that morning without a second thought. It had been my grandmother's. It has a story, I'm sure. My heart did a strange little flip. No one had noticed that brooch in years. Mark certainly hadn't. For this man, this stranger, to not only see it, but to understand that an object like that carries a history, it felt like he had looked past the suburban mom and seen a woman with a past, with her own stories. "It was my grandmother's," I found myself saying, my voice a little breathless. "She said it was to remind her that even in autumn, there's still beauty before the fall." The words came out before I could stop them, more poetic and personal than I intended. A faint, sad smile touched Julian's lips, a lovely sentiment, and a fitting one for Dickinson. And just like that, the boundary between us vanished. We weren't just teacher and parent anymore. We were two people talking about poetry, about sentiment, about the little anchors of beauty we hold on to. He spoke of his love for the romantic poets, the way they raged against the mundane, and as he spoke, his passion was palpable. He didn't just teach literature, he lived inside it. I found myself confessing my own long-lost dream of being a writer, a dream I hadn't spoken aloud to anyone, not even Mark, in over a decade. He didn't offer pity or false encouragement. He just listened, his hazel eyes filled with a deep, empathetic understanding that made me feel more seen than I had in years of marriage. I became acutely aware of everything. The way the late afternoon sun slanted through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The strength in his hands as he gestured, the subtle lines around his eyes when he smiled. I was aware of my own breathing, of the way I leaned forward in my chair, drawn into his orbit. A warmth spread through my chest, an unfamiliar and thrilling sensation, like a pilot light flickering back to life after years of being dormant. We were so lost in conversation that we both startled when the janitor's keys jangled in the hallway, a harsh, metallic sound that shattered the spell. I glanced at the clock on the wall. We had been talking for nearly 45 minutes. My 15-minute slot had been consumed, and I hadn't even noticed. A flush of embarrassment rose to my cheeks. "I'm so sorry. I've taken up so much of your time," I stammered, gathering my purse. "Not at all," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was absolute. This was a welcome reprieve. He stood as I did and walked me to the door. The air between us was thick with unspoken things. At the threshold, he extended his hand. It was a true pleasure, Eleanor. The use of my first name was quiet, deliberate, and it landed like a stone in a still pond. His hand was warm and firm, his grip holding mine for a beat longer than necessary. It wasn't a sexual touch, not yet, but it was intimate. It was a touch of recognition. I walked back to my car in a complete daze, my mind racing. The world, which had seemed so muted and gray just an hour before, now felt saturated with color. I could feel the cool autumn air on my skin. I could hear the rustle of every leaf. I could feel the ghost of his handshake on my palm. I got into my car and sat there for a long time, not starting the engine. My fingers went to the silver brooch on my jacket, tracing its delicate veins. He had seen it. He had seen me. And in that quiet, unassuming classroom, a dormant, dangerous seed had been planted. It wasn't lust, not then. It was something far more potent. It was the terrifying, intoxicating promise of being known. The days following the conference were unsettling. I moved through my life as if walking through water, every action feeling slow and deliberate, while my mind raced with the memory of him. The world, once a predictable landscape, now seemed filled with hidden possibilities, charged with a new and dangerous energy. I would be loading the dishwasher, and the mundane clink of plates would be drowned out by the memory of his voice, the low, thoughtful timbre of it as he said my name. Eleanor. He had not said Mrs. Henderson. He had peeled back the layer of matrimony and spoken directly to the woman underneath. My husband Mark would come home from work, kiss my cheek with the dry, absent-minded affection of a man performing a long-rehearsed habit, and ask about my day. I would reply, with practiced ease, fine, the usual, while a vibrant secret life was blooming within me, a life in which I replayed a 45-minute conversation with another man, dissecting every word, every glance, every fractional pause, the chasm between the woman I was pretending to be and the woman I felt myself becoming was growing with each passing hour. Our first meeting after that day felt like a collision of fate, though in retrospect, I know it was simply the inevitable mathematics of living in a small suburban town. I was in the grocery store, adrift in the sterile, fluorescent lighting of the produce aisle, feeling utterly domestic and invisible. I was weighing the merits of organic kale when I heard his voice behind me, asking a store employee about fresh basil. It was a simple, ordinary sound, but it struck me like a jolt of electricity. My heart leaped into my throat. I suddenly felt clumsy and exposed in my yoga pants and oversized sweater, my hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. I tried to become intensely interested in a stack of avocados, hoping he wouldn't see me. But he did. Eleanor? The sound of my name in that public, ordinary place was shockingly intimate. I turned, feigning surprise, a hot blush creeping up my neck. Julian. Mr. Croft. Hello. He smiled. A genuine, easy smile that made the lines around his eyes crinkle. Julian is fine, he said. He looked different outside the context of the school, more real, more accessible. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt that showed the lean muscle in his arms and a pair of worn jeans. He looked down at my shopping cart, filled with the mundane artifacts of my family's life. Milk, bread, chicken breasts, Lily's favorite cereal. Stocking up? He asked, his eyes twinkling with a gentle amusement. The conversation was brief, meaningless, filled with small talk about the impending change in weather and the pleasantries of the weekend. But the entire time, his gaze held mine, and beneath the surface of our polite words, a silent, frantic conversation was taking place. It was a conversation of pure awareness, of acknowledging the spark that had been lit in his classroom and seeing it, here, still burning between us. When we parted ways, him heading toward the spices and me toward the dairy aisle, I felt breathless, as if I had just run a marathon. The rest of my shopping was a blur. I went home and unpacked the groceries, but I wasn't there. I was still in the produce aisle, bathed in fluorescent light, feeling the warmth of his gaze on me. After that, something inside me shifted. I stopped leaving our encounters to chance. An obsession began to take root, a quiet, methodical recalibration of my daily life. I became a detective of his habits. Through casual questions to Lily, I learned he often stopped at the Daily Grind, a small coffee shop near the school, before his first class. Suddenly, I developed a craving for their lattes, a need to get out of the house in the morning. The first time I went, my hands shook as I ordered my coffee. I sat at a small table by the window, pretending to read a novel, but my entire being was focused on the door, waiting. When he walked in, and his eyes found mine across the room, the jolt of recognition was so potent it felt like a physical blow. He smiled, walked over. "Fancy meeting you here," he said. The word fancy laced with a shared, unspoken knowledge that this was anything but a coincidence. These coffee shop meetings became our ritual. Once, maybe twice a week, our separate lives would intersect for 20 minutes over the aroma of roasted beans. The pretense of Lily's education was a flimsy bridge we used to cross into more personal territory. We talked about books, music, the quiet frustrations of our lives. He spoke of a past in academia, a promising career he'd abandoned to teach high school, a decision shaded with a melancholy he never fully explained, but that I found endlessly captivating. In turn, I spoke of my life, not in terms of complaint, but with a carefully worded wistfulness about the woman I used to be before my world shrank to the size of a cul-de-sac. He understood. He never judged. He simply listened, and in his listening, I felt my own long-dormant self begin to stir and awaken. I started to take more care in my appearance, not for Mark, but for those 20 potential minutes in a coffee shop. I chose my dresses with more thought. I started wearing a subtle, vanilla-scented perfume. I was adorning myself for the possibility of him, resurrecting a version of myself I thought had been buried under years of motherhood and marriage. Our emails, too, began a subtle transformation. An official-looking message from him about an upcoming test for Lily's class would contain a postscript. "P.S.," he wrote once, "I saw that collection of Mary Oliver's poetry we discussed at the local bookstore. It made me think of our conversation. That was all it took." The bookstore became my next pilgrimage. I found the book, my fingers tracing the embossed title. And as if summoned by my thoughts, he was there, in the very same aisle. "I had a feeling I might find you here," he said, his voice a low murmur that didn't disturb the library-like silence. He reached past me to pull a different book from the shelf, his arm brushing against mine. The contact was fleeting, feather-light, nothing more than a whisper of fabric and skin, but it sent a shockwave through my entire system. It was the first time we had touched since that formal handshake, and my body registered it as a seismic event. He opened the book in his hands and showed me a poem, his finger pointing to a specific stanza. We stood there for a long moment, side by side, reading the words, the silence between us charged and heavy with everything we couldn't say. The poem was about two rivers running parallel, always close, never touching. The subtext was so loud it was a roar. I was living a dual life. In one, I was Ellie Henderson, carpooling, making dinners, discussing lawn care with my husband. But in my other, secret life, I was Eleanor. I was a woman who discussed poetry in quiet bookstores, who felt the thrill of a forbidden attraction, who was slowly, inexorably falling for her daughter's teacher. The guilt was a constant, low hum beneath the surface, but it was drowned out by the symphony of feeling alive again. The slow burn was becoming a fever. I would lie in bed at night, next to the warm, sleeping body of my husband, and feel an ache that had nothing to do with him. It was a profound, cavernous loneliness, a hunger for a connection that went beyond the shared mortgage and the child sleeping down the hall. It was a hunger for Julian. The question was no longer if something would happen, but how I could possibly survive until it did. The world had been set ablaze, and I was just waiting to be consumed. The annual school fundraiser was an exercise in manufactured elegance. The cavernous gymnasium, a place that usually smelled of sweat and rubber soles, was transformed by a constellation of cheap string lights and rented tables draped in burgundy cloths. The air was thick with a cacophony of competing perfumes, forced laughter, and the over-amplified sound of a local jazz trio. I was there, as always, as a parent volunteer, a fixed smile on my face, navigating the polite but transactional currents of suburban society. I felt a familiar sense of detachment, of playing a part in a play I hadn't auditioned for. Then I saw the volunteer roster posted on a large corkboard, and the world tilted on its axis. Silent auction table. Eleanor Henderson, Julian Croft. My breath caught in my chest. This wasn't a coincidence I had engineered. This felt like the hand of fate, or perhaps a crueler, more tempting force, pushing us directly into each other's path. A feeling of nervous, terrifying elation washed over me. For the next 4 hours, I wouldn't have to manufacture a reason to be near him. I was being commanded to. When I found him already at the table, straightening a stack of bid sheets, he looked up and our eyes met across the room. He gave me a small, private smile that felt like a secret in the midst of the crowd. "Looks like we're partners in crime tonight," he said, his voice a low counterpoint to the surrounding din. "Let's hope we don't have to auction off any of the students," I replied. The feeble joke, a flimsy cover for the frantic beating of my heart. He was wearing a dark blazer over a simple white shirt, the collar unbuttoned. He looked impossibly handsome, an island of quiet intelligence in an ocean of loud chatter. We spent the next few hours in a strange, intimate bubble. On the surface, we were a model of efficiency. We answered questions from parents. We encouraged higher bids. We kept the table organized with a seamless, unspoken rhythm. We were a team, but beneath that placid surface, a powerful, invisible current was flowing between us. Every interaction was charged. When he handed me a pen, his fingers brushed against mine, and a jolt, sharp and distinct, shot up my arm. When we both reached for a fallen bid sheet, our shoulders touched for a fraction of a second, and I had to suppress a shiver. We communicated in a language of stolen glances, of smiles that didn't quite reach our eyes but held a deeper meaning, of a shared awareness that was both thrilling and agonizing. I watched him as he spoke to another parent, the way he listened with such focused intensity, the easy charm he deployed, the intelligence that shone in his eyes. A fierce, terrible possessiveness rose in me. I wanted that attention for myself. I wanted to be the sole focus of that intense, empathetic gaze. As the night wore on, the energy in the gymnasium began to fade. The jazz trio packed up their instruments. The crowd thinned, parents collecting their coats and their winnings, their voices echoing in the increasingly empty space. Soon, the loud public performance was over, and a quiet, private reality began to set in. Our task was to reconcile the bid sheets and organize the items for pickup the next day. The vast room became our own private world, the string lights casting long, dancing shadows. We worked in a silence that was no longer comfortable, but heavy with anticipation. The air between us was thick, crackling with everything that had been held back for hours, for weeks. The unspoken tension felt like a living thing, a third person standing with us at the table. The breaking point came with something utterly mundane. I was gathering a stack of loose papers, and my elbow knocked a pen off the table. It skittered out of sight underneath. "I'll get it," I said quickly, grateful for the excuse to break the tension, to do something normal. I bent down, my knees complaining on the hard floor, and slipped under the heavy cloth. In the dim, enclosed space, I saw the pen. As I reached for it, he was suddenly there beside me, having bent down at the same moment from the other side. Our faces were inches apart. I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the deep flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek. The world outside the confines of that burgundy tablecloth simply ceased to exist. My own breath hitched in my throat. We were suspended in that moment for an eternity, the silence absolute except for the frantic thrumming of blood in my ears. Neither of us moved. He was so close, so impossibly close. Slowly, as if waking from a trance, we both straightened up, emerging from under the table into the open air. The moment was broken, but the atmosphere was irrevocably altered. A line had been crossed. A veil had been lifted. The air was now humming, vibrating with a raw, undeniable truth. I turned back to the table, my hands trembling, pretending to sort the papers I was holding, but I couldn't read the words. I was too aware of him standing behind me. I could feel his presence like a physical heat at my back. "Eleanor." My name was a whisper. I stopped moving, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Then, I felt his hand on my arm. It was not an accident. It was not a brush. It was a deliberate, definite touch. His fingers wrapped around my forearm, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin of my inner wrist. The touch was a brand, a claim, a question. It stopped my breath. It stopped my heart. All the air left the gymnasium. Slowly, I turned to face him. I looked from his strong, warm hand on my arm up to his face. His expression was stripped of all pretense. There was no easy smile, only a raw vulnerability and a desperate, aching need that mirrored my own. His eyes searched mine, and he must have found the answer he was looking for, because he didn't let go. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice low and strained. "This," pretending. "At the coffee shop, in the bookstore, every email I write you, I'm just looking for an excuse." He took a slight step closer, his grip on my arm tightening just enough to keep me there. "Eleanor, I can't stop thinking about you. It's consuming me." The confession hung in the air between us, beautiful and terrifying. Every ounce of societal conditioning, every vow I had ever made, screamed at me to pull away, to say we can't, to run. But I was paralyzed. Not by fear, but by a profound sense of recognition. The words he spoke were the words my own soul had been screaming for weeks. In that moment, my life as a wife and a mother, my pristine suburban existence, all of it became a distant, muffled sound. The only reality was the warmth of his hand on my skin, the desperate truth in his eyes, and the wild, frantic beating of my own heart in response. I didn't pull away. I didn't speak. I simply stood there, held by his gaze, and gave him the only answer I had. I leaned into his touch, just a fraction of an inch, a silent, complete, and total surrender. There was no going back. We both knew it. His hand on my arm was an anchor in a swirling sea of confusion and desire. The vast, empty gymnasium seemed to shrink around us until only we existed, caught in the amber glow of the lonely string lights. The world had fallen away. "We can't stay here," he finally said, his voice rough, cutting through the charged silence. He released my arm, but the heat of his touch lingered on my skin like a brand. He didn't wait for my reply, simply turned and started walking toward the exit. I followed him as if pulled by an invisible string, my legs moving on their own accord. My mind was a silent scream of protests and permissions, a frantic debate between wife and woman, but my body had already made its choice. It was walking toward him. The night air was cold, a stark contrast to the heat flushing my skin. The parking lot was a dark, empty expanse under a moonless sky. Each crunch of our shoes on the asphalt sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. I expected him to walk me to my minivan, that symbol of my domesticated life, to pause awkwardly and say a stilted goodnight. That would have been the sensible, survivable end to the evening. But he didn't. He walked right past my car and continued toward his own, a simple, unassuming sedan. He unlocked the doors, the electronic chirp splitting the silence, and then he turned to me. "Get in, Eleanor." It was not a question. It was a quiet command, a plea, and a promise all at once. The last vestiges of my resistance crumbled into dust. I got in the car. The drive was short, only 10 minutes, but it felt like a journey to another universe. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the frantic, silent rhythm of my own heart. I stared out the window as the familiar streets of my town slid past, the neat houses with their dark windows and sleeping families, looking like a movie set from someone else's life. This could not be my reality. My reality was PTA meetings and grocery lists, not this silent, high-stakes journey into the unknown with my daughter's teacher. With every turn of the wheel, he was driving me further away from the woman I was supposed to be. I felt a terrifying thrill, a sense of falling from a great height, and I had no desire to pull the cord on the parachute. His apartment was on the second floor of a modest, older brick building. The hallway smelled of old carpets and the faint aroma of other people's dinners. He fumbled with the key for a moment, and the sound of it scraping in the lock was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Then the lock clicked open, and the sound seemed to sever the final thread connecting me to my old life. He pushed the door open and stood aside to let me pass. The room was just as I had imagined, bathed in the soft, warm light of a single lamp. Books overflowed from shelves, stacked on the floor, resting on the small coffee table. It smelled of paper and dust and coffee. It smelled of him. He closed the door behind us, and the final, definitive click echoed in the sudden, profound silence. He didn't turn on any other lights. We just stood there in the entryway, 2 feet apart, breathing the same charged air. Then he moved. In 2 long strides, he closed the distance between us. His hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones, his gaze so intense it felt like it was stripping me bare. "Eleanor," he breathed, and then his mouth was on mine. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of starvation. It was weeks of unspoken words, of stolen glances, of simmering, repressed desire erupting in a single, desperate moment. It was a collision. His lips were firm and demanding, and I answered with a hunger that shocked me, my hands tangling in his thick hair, pulling him impossibly closer. The polite, restrained Eleanor Henderson was gone, and in her place was a ravenous woman, a woman who had been starved for a touch that meant something. We broke apart, gasping, our foreheads resting against each other. His hand slid from my face down to my shoulders, then to the zipper at the back of my dress. Without a word, he pulled it down. The sound of the zipper was a siren's call, and my own hands went to the buttons of his blazer, then the shirt beneath, fumbling in my haste. My dress pooled at my feet, leaving me standing before him in nothing but my slip. He looked at me, his eyes dark with a raw, almost painful adoration. He didn't look at me like a husband who had seen the same body for 15 years. He looked at me like I was a revelation. "God, you are so beautiful," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, not with greed, but with a kind of reverence, his hand covering one of my breasts. Through the thin lace, his palm was a scorching heat. He gently kneaded the soft flesh, and a whimper escaped my lips. This was it, the final moment of choice. "Julian," I whispered, the word a weak protest, a final nod to the life I was betraying. "We can't. This is wrong." He silenced me with another kiss, deeper and slower this time, a kiss that tasted of confession and surrender. "It's too late for that," he murmured against my lips. "It's been too late for a long time." He scooped me into his arms, and I wrapped my legs around his waist, my mouth never leaving his. He carried me the few steps from the entryway and lowered me to the thick, soft rug in the center of his living room, surrounded by the silent witness of 1,000 books. He came down over me, his weight a welcome, solid pressure. The world narrowed to the space between our bodies. The feel of the rough wool of the rug against my back, the smooth, hot skin of his chest against mine. His mouth left my lips and blazed a trail down my neck, across my collarbone. When he took my nipple into his mouth through the lace, a guttural cry was torn from my throat. All thought, all guilt, all reason, incinerated in a blast of pure, unadulterated sensation. He stripped away my remaining clothes, his hands exploring every curve, every dip, every inch of skin, with a worshiper's devotion. "Your skin," he whispered, his lips against my stomach. "I've dreamed of this." I arched against him, my own hands exploring the hard planes of his back, the taut muscles in his shoulders. I needed him, with an urgency that was primal and absolute. "Julian, please," I begged, the words torn from me. "Now." He positioned himself between my legs, and I opened for him without hesitation. He looked into my eyes as he entered me, a slow, deliberate push that felt like a homecoming. I gasped, my head thrown back, my fingers digging into the rug. The feeling of being filled by him, of our bodies finally, completely connected, was so intense it bordered on pain. "Oh God, Julian," I moaned, the sound raw and unrestrained. He began to move, a steady, powerful rhythm that was both a claiming and a giving. All the loneliness, all the years of feeling invisible, all the quiet desperation melted away with every thrust. There was only this man, this room, this unbelievable pleasure. My soft, hesitant protests from earlier were replaced by desperate, shameless cries for more. Yes, like that. Don't stop. The friction of our bodies, the sound of our ragged breaths, the sight of his face above mine, taut with a pleasure that mirrored my own. It was a symphony of the forbidden. The pressure built within me, a brilliant, coiling heat. My world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of light and sensation. I cried out his name, a sharp, shattering sound. As the release tore through me, a wave of such violent, exquisite pleasure that I thought I might die from it. I felt his own body tense and shudder, his release a hot flood deep inside me as he collapsed against me, his name a guttural groan against my neck. We lay there, tangled and slick with sweat, on the floor of his living room, our hearts pounding in unison, in the profound, deafening silence of the fall. The silence that followed the storm was more profound than any I had ever known. It was a silence composed of spent passion, of the thunderous beating of our own hearts, and of the colossal weight of what we had just done. I lay on the rug, my cheek pressed against the rough wool, the world slowly coming back into focus. The lamplight cast a soft, forgiving glow on the ceiling. Julian's arm was a heavy, warm weight across my waist, his body still tangled with mine. For a long time, we didn't move, didn't speak. To speak would be to admit that a world existed outside of this room, a world with consequences, and neither of us was ready for that. Eventually, the chill of the air on my bare skin brought me back to reality. Slowly, we untangled our limbs. The process of getting dressed was a clumsy, heartbreakingly awkward ritual. We were two strangers who had just shared the most intimate act, now trying to reconstruct the armor of our clothes. I avoided his eyes as I pulled on my slip, as I fumbled with the zipper of my dress. Each garment felt like a lie I was putting back on, a costume for the role I had to play. He pulled on his shirt, leaving it unbuttoned, and watched me with an expression I couldn't decipher. It was a mixture of awe and a deep, profound sadness. There were no easy words for this. There was no "what happens now?" We both knew. We had detonated a bomb in the center of our lives, and this was the quiet, ringing aftermath. "I should go," I whispered, the words sounding foreign and brittle in the stillness. He simply nodded. "I'll drive you to your car." The ride back to the school was the inverse of the journey to his apartment. The tension was not of anticipation, but of consequence. The world outside the car windows seemed accusatory now, the dark houses filled with lives we had both trespassed against. I felt fragile, exposed, as if anyone who looked at me could see the sin imprinted on my skin. As he pulled into the empty school parking lot, he killed the engine, and we sat in the shared darkness. He reached across the console and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. The simple, solid feel of his hand holding mine was an anchor. It felt more real than my wedding ring. "Eleanor," he began, then stopped, as if he couldn't find the words. He didn't need to. I understood. Before I got out, I turned to him. "Julian," I said, my voice barely audible, "be careful." It was a plea for him, for me, for us. "Always," he replied. "I'll be in touch." Driving my own car home, I felt like a fugitive. The familiar streets were a map of my betrayal. I parked in the driveway and sat for a long time, the engine off, clutching the steering wheel. The scent of him, of his skin and his apartment was all over me, a ghostly presence in the sterile interior of my minivan. I slipped into my house like a burglar, my shoes in my hand. The silence inside was different from the silence in his apartment. This was the placid, orderly silence of a life built on routine and predictability. It felt like a tomb. I crept up the stairs, my heart pounding with the fear of waking Mark. I peered into Lily's room. She was asleep, her face peaceful in the soft glow of her nightlight, the picture of innocence. A wave of guilt so powerful it made me physically sick washed over me. What had I done to her? To the sanctity of this home? I felt like a monster, a corrupting force that had brought something sordid and ugly into this clean, safe place. I showered in the dark, the hot water beating down on me, but I couldn't wash away the feeling of his hands on my body. I couldn't wash away the memory of my own cries of pleasure. I slipped into bed beside Mark. His back was to me, his breathing deep and even. He was a good man, a kind, decent, predictable man. And I had shattered his trust in a way he couldn't even imagine. I lay there, rigid, staring into the darkness, my body a war zone. One part of me was drowning in shame, replaying the lies, the risk, the profound betrayal of my family. I was a cheater, a sordid cliché. But another part of me, a part I was ashamed to acknowledge, was incandescent. My skin was still humming, my nerves alive and tingling. My body, which had felt like a functional, sexless machine for years, was now a vibrant, sensitized instrument. It remembered the exquisite friction, the commanding strength, the earth-shattering release. It remembered feeling wanted, desired, consumed. And that part of me, the treacherous, selfish, vibrantly alive part, did not feel an ounce of regret. The next morning was brutal. For one blissful, merciful second upon waking, I forgot. Then, the full weight of the previous night crashed down on me. I went through the morning routine in a fog, making coffee, packing Lily's lunch, listening to Mark talk about a problem at his office. It was a flawless performance. I was an actress in the play of my own life, and no one suspected a thing. When Mark kissed me goodbye at the door, his usual perfunctory peck on the lips, I had to fight the urge to flinch. The casual intimacy felt like a violation. The guilt was a physical presence, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of my stomach. But as the day wore on, another sensation began to rise, eclipsing the guilt. It was a low, persistent thrum of euphoria. I caught my reflection in the hall mirror and stopped. My eyes were brighter. There was a faint, rosy flush to my cheeks. I looked alive. The memory of what we had done was a drug, and its effects were potent. The shame was the price of admission, but the high was the feeling of being utterly, completely reborn. My phone became a sacred object, a direct line to that secret, vibrant world. I kept it with me constantly, my stomach twisting with a nervous, hopeful energy every time it buzzed. The silence from him was an agony of suspense. Did he regret it? Was I just a momentary lapse in judgment for him? The doubts were a form of torture. Then, in the middle of the afternoon, as I was mindlessly folding laundry, it happened. A buzz, an unknown number. My hands trembled as I opened the text. "It's Julian. Are you all right?" Relief washed through me so powerfully, my knees felt weak. I sank onto the bed, my fingers hovering over the screen. He hadn't forgotten. He wasn't disgusted. He was worried about me. "I'm okay," I typed, then deleted it. Too bland. "I'm a mess," I typed next. Too dramatic. Finally, I settled on the simple truth. "I'm still breathing. Are you?" His reply was instantaneous. "Barely. I haven't stopped thinking about last night." A giddy, dangerous joy bloomed in my chest. "Neither have I confessed." The words a liberation. The texts that followed were cautious at first, then grew bolder, a rapid escalation of shared longing. We were two co-conspirators, reliving every detail in a secret digital space. The drug of his attention, of our shared secret, was more potent than the memory of the sex itself. The guilt was still there, a shadow in the corner of the room, but the addiction was brighter, stronger, and far more compelling. His final text of the day appeared on my screen, its light illuminating my face in the dimming afternoon light. "I need to see you again, Eleanor. Soon." The question wasn't if I would agree. The question was how I had ever lived before this. The addiction had taken hold, and I was already desperate for another fix. The decision to see him again was a fever in my blood, a frantic, joyful panic. But the reality of it required a cold, calculated precision I never knew I possessed. My life, once an open book of predictable routines, now had to be rewritten, edited, and filled with fabricated chapters. The first lie was the hardest. It felt like a stone in my mouth. We had decided via our increasingly daring text messages to meet on a Thursday afternoon. Thursday was my day for errands, a bland, formless block of time that was mine to account for. Now I had to give it a name and a shape. "I'm thinking of joining a book club," I announced to Mark one evening, my voice a carefully crafted imitation of casualness as I loaded the dishwasher. "Sarah from next door is in one. They meet on Thursdays." He grunted from behind his newspaper. "Sounds nice," he said, the words utterly devoid of interest. And just like that, the foundation was laid. It was terrifyingly easy. Over the next few days, I built the lie piece by piece. I bought a copy of the book I claimed we were reading. I invented names and personalities for the other members. I became a novelist, and my own life was my fiction. Each detail was a brick in the wall I was building between my family and my secret. The days leading up to our meeting were a blur of heightened anxiety and intoxicating anticipation. I was a spy in my own home. I felt as if my secret was a visible aura, that Mark or Lily could look at me and see the truth shimmering around my skin. I became jumpy, irritable, my mind constantly elsewhere, rehearsing my alibi, imagining his touch. When Thursday finally arrived, I left the house with a cheerful, "See you at dinner," and a heart that was pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard from the street. Being with him again was like coming home to a place I'd never been. The moment his apartment door closed behind me, the suffocating costume of Ellie Henderson, wife and mother, fell away. I was just Eleanor. We didn't speak at first. He simply pulled me into his arms and I buried my face in his neck, inhaling his scent, the intoxicating mixture of clean laundry, coffee, and him. The desperation of our first encounter was replaced by a deeper, more confident intimacy. We made love slowly this time, learning the landscape of each other's bodies, memorizing the feel of skin and the taste of mouths. In his arms, in his bed, the world was reduced to a perfect, sustainable reality. There were no lies, no husbands, no daughters. There was only us. In his world, I was not invisible. I was the only thing he saw. This was the fix. This was the feeling I would lie and cheat and steal for. After that second meeting, the affair took on a life of its own, a complex organism that needed to be fed and protected. We became meticulous. We bought cheap prepaid phones, burner phones, so we could talk and text without leaving a digital trail on our family plans. His contact in my real phone was deleted. My number in his was gone. Our secret world was now completely separate, accessible only through these illicit devices that I kept hidden at the bottom of my gym bag. We established rules. No calls after 9 p.m., no texts on weekends unless it was an absolute emergency. We had a coded language, mundane phrases that held explosive meanings. "Did you pick up the dry cleaning?" meant, "Can you get away tonight?" It was a thrilling, exhausting game of espionage, and our lives were the prize. The mental toll was immense. I was perpetually on edge, living with a low-grade hum of paranoia. Sleep offered little escape, my dreams a tangled mess of discovery and loss. Every unexpected ring of the doorbell, every time Mark picked up my phone to check the time, sent a jolt of ice-cold adrenaline through my veins. I started to see suspicion in innocent questions. When Mark asked, "You were out for a long time at the grocery store," my mind would race. Does he know? Did someone see me? I was living on a razor's edge, and the constant fear was a corrosive acid, slowly eating away at my peace of mind. The close call came on a Saturday afternoon, a day that was supposed to be safe, a day when the secret world was meant to be dormant. I was in the kitchen, making a salad, and Lily was sitting at the counter, scrolling through her phone. My real phone, the one from my public life, was on the granite countertop beside her. I was so conditioned to the safety of the burner phone that I had become careless. A text message notification lit up the screen. Before I could snatch it away, Lily glanced over, her brow furrowed. "Who's Mr. Croft?" she asked, her voice casual, innocent. The world stopped. The knife in my hand felt impossibly heavy. My blood ran cold. I could feel the color draining from my face. I had forgotten to delete his contact after the parent-teacher conference. It was still there, a digital ghost from the life before. My mind, which had become so adept at spinning lies, went into overdrive. I forced a light, airy laugh. "Oh, that's just a group text for the parent volunteers," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally high. "He's the faculty advisor for the library fundraiser committee. Just reminding us about the meeting next week." I prayed it was a plausible lie. I prayed she wouldn't ask to see the message. She looked at me for a second, her teenage indifference, her greatest gift to me in that moment. "Oh, okay," she said, and her attention went right back to her phone. She had believed me. The crisis was averted, but I was left trembling, my heart hammering against my ribs. I leaned against the counter, my knees weak with relief and terror. It had been that close. A single text message, a moment of carelessness, and my entire world would have imploded. That night, I was a whirlwind of maternal overcompensation. I made Lily's favorite dessert. I suggested we all watch a movie together, snuggling on the couch under a blanket like a perfect, happy family. It was a desperate, guilt-ridden performance. As Mark put his arm around me, I leaned into his familiar, solid presence and felt like the most despicable woman on earth. The lies were no longer just words I spoke. They had become a physical barrier, a wall of glass between me and the people I loved. I was right there, but I was a universe away. Later, as I lay in the dark, my burner phone clutched in my hand under the covers, I read the messages from Julian. Messages of desire, of intellect, of a connection so profound it felt more real than the sleeping man beside me. I knew this double life was a sickness. It was a poison I was willingly drinking every single day. The fear of being caught was a constant, gnawing anxiety. But the thought of going back to the gray, silent world of my life before him, that was a death I could not face. The deception was exhausting. The guilt was a heavy cloak, but the affair was the only thing that made me feel alive. I was no longer just deceiving my family. I was deceiving myself, pretending I could control the fire I had started. But I was addicted to the warmth, even as I knew with absolute certainty that it would eventually burn my entire world to the ground. The lies had become a suffocating, necessary armor I wore every day, but beneath them, the promise of our next meeting was the heart that kept my secret self alive. This time, there was no frantic, desperate scramble. This was a deliberate act, a calculated theft of time from the lives we were supposed to be living. We chose a place of perfect anonymity, a clean, unremarkable motel on the highway outside of town, a place that existed in a transient world of its own, untethered to the geography of our real lives. It was a non-place, and for 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon, it was going to be our sanctuary. The drive there was different. I wasn't filled with the chaotic panic of our first night, nor the anxious, paranoid energy of the subsequent weeks. Today, I felt a calm, humming sense of purpose. I was not a woman falling into a mistake. I was a woman driving toward the only thing that felt true. I had prepared for him. In the sterile, impersonal bathroom of the motel room, I shed the skin of Eleanor Henderson, the sensible slacks, the modest blouse. Underneath, I wore a secret I had bought only for his eyes, a delicate, expensive set of black lace lingerie. It was an act of rebellion, a claiming of my own body, a body that had felt for years like public property, belonging to a husband, to children, to the world. This lingerie was a declaration that my body was, for this afternoon, entirely my own, to be given to whom I chose. When I heard his soft knock, my heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat of anticipation. He stood in the doorway, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. He carried the weight of the outside world on his shoulders, a slight tension in his jaw, but when his eyes met mine, it all melted away. He stepped inside and closed the door, the click of the lock sealing us in our private world. He didn't rush toward me. He took in the sight of me, standing before him in my coat, and a slow, appreciative smile touched his lips. "Hello. You," he said softly. He took my coat, his movements unhurried, and when he saw what I was wearing underneath, his breath caught. His eyes darkened with a mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated adoration. He didn't speak. He simply reached out a hand, his fingers tracing the scalloped edge of the lace over my collarbone. "I wondered," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "what you were hiding under that sensible exterior." He didn't touch me with greed, but with a connoisseur's reverence. His gaze traveled down my body, a tangible, electric touch that made my skin prickle and my nipples harden against the lace. "You are a masterpiece, Eleanor." His words were a balm on a wound I never knew I had. He led me to the bed, the cheap polyester bedspread, a stark contrast to the exquisite feeling of his attention. He laid me back against the pillows and began a slow, meticulous worship. He undressed me with an artist's care, his fingers unhooking the bra, his eyes feasting on my bared breasts. He didn't call them by a clinical name. "My beautiful twin peaks of snow," he murmured, quoting some long-forgotten poem before lowering his head. The feeling of his mouth on my breast was an explosion of pure sensation. It was not the clumsy, hurried mouth of a husband, but the skilled, patient mouth of a lover. He laved and suckled and teased until I was writhing beneath him, a low, continuous moan escaping my lips. His hands and mouth were everywhere, exploring every inch of me, from the sensitive skin of my inner wrists to the arch of my foot. He was mapping my body, learning its secrets, and with every touch, he was branding me as his. He slid the thin scrap of lace from my hips, and I lay completely bare before him. I felt no shame, no self-consciousness, only a profound sense of liberation. He moved down, his lips trailing a line of fire over my stomach, and I tensed with a mixture of fear and shocking desire. He paused, his lips hovering just above the curls of hair at the apex of my thighs. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with a dark fire. "You are so wet for me, Ellie," he stated the words, a raw, possessive claim that sent a jolt of pure lust through me. So ready. My body arched toward him, a silent plea. All pretense was gone. All resistance had been incinerated hours, days, weeks ago. "Then take me, Julian," I begged, my voice a ragged whisper. "I want you, deep inside me." His name was a prayer on my lips as he rose over me. This time, there was no fumbling, no frantic haste. He entered me with a single, smooth, powerful thrust that filled me completely, stealing my breath. I cried out, a sharp, purely ecstatic sound. He stayed still inside me for a long moment, letting us both feel the perfect, profound rightness of the connection. He leaned down and kissed me, a deep, soul-stealing kiss as our bodies were joined. Then he began to move. It was a different rhythm from the first time. It was a confident, knowing dance. He watched my face, his eyes locked on mine, as if he could read my pleasure there. He found a rhythm that made my toes curl, my back arch, my mind dissolve into a haze of pure sensation. My hands clutched at his back, my nails leaving faint scratches on his skin. This was not just sex. This was a communion, a desperate, beautiful act of two souls finding a temporary solace in a forbidden world. The pleasure was building into a wave, a towering, unstoppable force. I was helpless in its path. My breath came in ragged sobs, my hips meeting his thrusts with a frantic, primal urgency. "Harder! Julian!" I cried out, the words ripped from the deepest part of me. "Oh, God, please." He drove into me faster, deeper, his own control shattering. I could feel the climax approaching, a brilliant, white-hot light at the edge of my consciousness. I was losing myself, becoming nothing but this feeling, this man. "I'm coming, Julian. The cry was torn from my throat as the wave crashed over me, a violent, shattering release that left me limp and trembling, my body convulsing around his. My scream seemed to trigger his own release, and I felt his powerful, shuddering climax deep within me, his name a raw, guttural groan against my ear. We collapsed together, our bodies slick with sweat, our limbs tangled in the cheap motel sheets. For a long time, the only sound was our harsh, ragged breathing slowly returning to normal. He shifted his weight off me but kept me pulled close, my head resting on his chest, his arm a secure weight around my shoulders. This was the peak. This was the moment of perfect, stolen peace. Here, in this anonymous room, there were no lies, no guilt, no consequences. There was only the warm, languid afterglow of a passion so intense it had burned the rest of the world away. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of his heart beneath my ear, and for a few perfect, crystalline moments, I allowed myself to believe that this was a world we could live in forever. The days that followed our afternoon in the motel were lived in a golden haze. I floated through my life, a serene smile on my lips, my body still humming with the memory of his touch. The world was a beautiful, benevolent place. The tedious errands, the domestic chores, the empty conversations with Mark, none of it could touch me. I was encased in the armor of our secret, a secret so precious and potent that it rendered the rest of my life pale and insignificant. I had reached the peak, the dizzying, sun-drenched summit of my illicit happiness, and I foolishly believed I could build a home there. I had forgotten that from such a height, the only way to go is down. The fall began, as I should have known it would, with Lily. It was a Wednesday evening, the sky outside turning a soft, bruised purple. I was in the kitchen, the familiar scent of garlic and olive oil in the air, the rhythmic chop of a knife on a wooden board, the peaceful soundtrack to my domestic performance. I was humming, a thing I hadn't done in years. I felt calm, content, untouchable. Lily drifted in from school, dropped her heavy backpack on the floor with a thud, and pulled a carton of orange juice from the refrigerator. The scene was a portrait of mundane, suburban perfection. "How was school?" I asked, my voice light and cheerful. "Fine," she mumbled, the universal teenage reply. She took a long drink from the carton, and I made a mental note to tell her not to do that. She leaned against the counter, watching me chop vegetables. "Actually," she said, her voice thoughtful, "it was kind of weird today. I kept my eyes on the knife, my hands steady. Weird how." "Mr. Croft," she said, and the sound of his name, so casual and innocent on her lips, was a physical blow. He seemed really sad. I paused, the knife hovering over a half-diced onion. A cold, prickling sensation spread across my skin. I forced myself to continue chopping, the motion mechanical, detached from my suddenly frantic mind. "Sad?" I tried to make my voice sound merely curious, a mother's mild interest. "He's usually so energetic, you know. He gets really into the discussions about the poems and stuff. But today, he was just quiet. He seemed so far away." She took another sip of juice, her brow furrowed with genuine youthful concern. He kept staring out the window. It was like he wasn't even in the room with us. His eyes just looked heavy. "I hope he's okay." She pushed herself off the counter, her moment of reflection over. "I have a ton of homework," she announced, grabbing her backpack and heading for the stairs. "Dinner in 20, I called after her, my voice a shockingly normal imitation of my own. The moment her footsteps faded, my hand flew to the counter to steady myself, the knife clattering onto the cutting board. The peaceful kitchen had become a hostile space. The smell of the garlic was suddenly nauseating. Lily's words echoed in my ears. Sad, far away, heavy. My two worlds, which I had so meticulously, so arrogantly, kept separate, had just collided with the force of a car crash. The man my daughter was describing was not the confident, passionate lover who had worshipped my body in a motel room just days before. Her Mr. Croft was a man in pain, a man whose sadness was so palpable that a 16-year-old girl could see it, and a voice, cold and sharp as broken glass, screamed in my mind, "You did this to him." The affair was no longer a beautiful, secret garden where we met in bliss. It was a poison, and it was seeping through the cracks, leaking into his real life, into the classroom, into the periphery of my daughter's world. Lily's innocent empathy was a blinding spotlight thrown onto the grotesque selfishness of my actions. I had been so consumed with my own reawakening, my own pleasure, that I had never truly stopped to consider the emotional price he might be paying. My mind raced, replaying our last encounter. I tried to see it through this new, terrifying lens. Was his passion a mask for a deeper turmoil? Was the adoration in his eyes a desperate attempt to escape a sadness that was waiting for him the moment he left my arms? The memory, once so perfect and golden, was now tainted, corrupted by doubt. Had I been so drunk on the feeling of being desired that I had failed to see the man in front of me? The thought was unbearable. I felt a surge of panic so intense I thought I might be sick. This was no longer a game between two consenting adults. This was a reckless act with the potential for real, tangible collateral damage. And the person who had first noticed the cracks, the first potential victim, was my own daughter. I fled to the master bathroom, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I retrieved the burner phone from its hiding place, my secret heart, and my fingers flew across the tiny keyboard. "Lily came home from school," I typed, the words feeling like a confession of a terrible crime. "She said you were sad today, that your eyes were heavy. She was worried about you, Julian. What's wrong? Is this us? Is this getting to be too much?" I sent the message and then stared at the screen, my own reflection, a pale, haunted mask in the dark glass. The wait for his reply was the purest form of torture. Each silent second that passed was a confirmation of my worst fears. I imagined him at home, perhaps with a wife, a family, the weight of his own lies pressing down on him. I had seen our affair as an escape, a liberation. What if for him it was just another cage? The phone buzzed in my hand and I nearly dropped it. His reply was short, a single sentence that did nothing to quell the inferno of my anxiety. "It's nothing, Eleanor. Just a long week. Don't worry. Don't worry." The words were a blatant dismissal, a lie so thin it was transparent. It was the kind of thing you said to a stranger, not to a lover who held your secrets. It was a wall, and he had just built it between us. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was not nothing. It was everything. The beautiful, fragile facade of our affair had just cracked. And through that crack, I could see the cold, hard reality of the world we had tried to ignore. I looked at myself in the mirror, at the woman who had felt so alive just hours before. She was gone. In her place was a terrified stranger, a woman who had just realized that the fire she had been playing with was not just a source of warmth, but a conflagration that threatened to burn down everything and everyone she had ever claimed to love. The bliss was over. The reckoning had begun. The aftermath of Lily's innocent observation was a slow-acting poison. The golden haze of the affair evaporated, leaving behind a cold, gray reality. My communication with Julian, once a source of illicit, heart-thumping joy, became a new form of torture. The burner phone, my secret totem, now felt heavy and dangerous in my hand. My texts to him were frantic, needy missives, filled with questions he refused to answer. "Are you sure you're okay? We need to talk about this." His replies, when they came, were clipped, evasive, and infuriatingly calm. "Everything is fine, Eleanor. Please don't worry. I'm just busy." Each message was a brick in the wall he was building between us, and it was a wall I had no idea how to breach. The easy intimacy, the feeling of being the only two people in the universe, was gone. It was replaced by my spiraling anxiety and his resolute, impenetrable distance. This new, corrosive uncertainty began to spill into my real life, contaminating everything. I became a ghost in my own home. At the dinner table, the sound of Mark and Lily's chatter would fade into a distant murmur as I spiraled into obsessive thought, dissecting Julian's texts, replaying Lily's words, trying to find a pattern, an answer, a reassurance that wasn't there. "Mom," Lily's voice would cut through the fog. "I asked if you wanted the salt." I would blink, forcing a smile, feeling as if I were returning from a million miles away. "Sorry, honey, just spacing out." I was physically present, but my soul was elsewhere, trapped in a maze of fear and speculation. I became jumpy and secretive. The sound of Mark's car in the driveway would send a jolt of panic through me, my first instinct to hide my phone, to wipe my face clean of any illicit emotion. I lost my appetite. I couldn't sleep, lying awake for hours in the dark, my mind a relentless engine of worst-case scenarios. I was shedding weight, and dark, bruised circles began to appear under my eyes. The vibrant, alive woman who had glowed in the mirror just weeks ago had been replaced by a pale, haunted stranger. And my husband, the man I had dismissed as unobservant and emotionally distant, began to notice. The confrontation didn't come as a fiery explosion, an accusation hurled across a room. It came as all the most devastating things in my life with Mark did, quietly, gently, and with a sincerity that was impossible to fight. It was a Sunday night. Lily was in her room, and we were in the living room, the television flickering with some crime drama neither of us was watching. The air between us was thick with the things I couldn't say. I was staring at the screen, but I was seeing Julian's face, his sad eyes as Lily had described them. Mark picked up the remote and the screen went black, plunging the room into a soft, quiet dimness. The sudden silence was deafening. "Ellie," he said, his voice calm and low. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the blank television screen, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. "We need to talk." This was it, the moment I had been dreading. My mind scrambled, assembling the architecture of a new lie, preparing my defenses. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice thin. He shifted on the couch to face me. That's what I want to ask you, he said. Is everything all right with you? I finally forced myself to look at him. His face wasn't angry or accusatory. It was etched with a deep, genuine concern that was far more terrifying than rage. You seem so far away lately, he continued, his voice gentle. Like a ghost in the house. You're barely eating, you're not sleeping. You jump every time the phone rings. He paused, reaching out and placing his hand over mine on the couch cushion. His hand was warm, familiar, the hand of the man I had promised my life to. If something's wrong, you can tell me. Whatever it is. If you're unhappy, if you're sick, I'm your husband, Ellie. I'm here. I just want to help. His kindness was a physical blow. It disarmed me completely. I had been prepared for a fight, for accusations I could deny, for anger I could use to justify my own actions. But this gentle, loving concern, it left me with nothing. There was no enemy here. The only villain in the room was me. I felt a hysterical urge to laugh and to sob at the same time. He thought I was sick or depressed. The truth was so much worse, so much more sordid, that it was unspeakable. A confession hovered on the tip of my tongue, a desperate need to lance the wound, to tell him everything. But I was a coward. I looked into his kind, worried eyes, and I chose the lie. I'm fine, Mark, I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth, really, just tired. Stressed with things. That's all. The lie was pathetic, hollow, and an insult to his intelligence, but it was all I had. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze searching my face, and I knew he didn't believe me. Not really, but he was a man who avoided conflict, and he let it go. He squeezed my hand. Okay, he said, though his eyes were still filled with a sad confusion. Well, just know that I'm here. Whatever you need, I love you. He leaned over and kissed my forehead, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated affection. Then he stood up and went to bed, leaving me alone in the silent, dark living room. His words, I love you, echoed in the silence, each one a fresh stab of guilt. I looked around the room, at the life that surrounded me. On the mantelpiece was a photo from our wedding, two young people filled with a naive, hopeful certainty. There was a framed picture of Lily's first steps, her tiny hand clutching Mark's finger. There were the worn armchairs, the scuff marks on the floor from years of life, the comfortable, accumulated history of a family. This was my reality. It was a reality built on the foundation of the quiet, decent man sleeping upstairs, a man whose love I had treated like a disposable commodity. I thought of Julian. The memory of his touch, of the searing, mind-obliterating passion was still a potent drug. He had reawakened a part of me I thought was dead, but that world was now a place of anxiety, of his unexplained sadness, of panicked texts and evasive replies. It was a thrilling, beautiful fantasy that was beginning to curdle, to show its rotten, unstable foundations. The high was no longer worth the crushing weight of the fear and the lies. Mark's gentle confrontation had forced me to see the truth. The affair wasn't an escape. It was an act of demolition, and I was swinging the wrecking ball, aimed squarely at the heart of my own life, at the heart of a good man who deserved none of this. I could no longer see myself as a woman seeking her own happiness. I was simply a creature of destruction. In the crushing weight of that silence, a terrible clarity descended upon me. This couldn't go on. The balancing act was over. The strain was going to break me, or it was going to break everything around me. I could not live in two worlds any longer. One of them had to die. And as I sat there, surrounded by the ghosts of the life I was betraying, I knew a choice had to be made. I had to see him one more time. Not for a passionate, secret rendezvous, but to say the word that should have been said from the very beginning, goodbye. The morning after Mark's gentle confrontation, I woke with a new and terrible sense of clarity. The chaotic storm of anxiety and desire that had raged within me for months had finally broken, leaving behind a cold, desolate calm. The frantic, obsessive need for Julian was gone, replaced by the heavy, unyielding weight of a decision that had already been made in the darkest hours of the night. The fever had passed, and in its wake, I saw with perfect, heartbreaking lucidity the wreckage it had caused. I knew what I had to do. It was not a choice between two men, but a choice between a beautiful, ruinous fantasy and a difficult, salvageable reality. I picked up the burner phone for what I knew would be the last time. The device, once a thrilling portal to a secret world, now felt like a cold, dead object in my hand. My fingers were steady as I typed the message, my words devoid of the frantic energy that had defined our recent communications. We need to talk. In person, not at your apartment. I paused, thinking of a place that was neutral, a place that held no ghosts of our passion. Riverbend Park, by the old weeping willow. 3 o'clock this afternoon? It was a summons, not an invitation. His reply came within minutes, a single resigned word. Okay. The park was ablaze with the heartbreaking beauty of late autumn. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. The leaves, in their final, defiant glory, painted the landscape in shades of gold, crimson, and rust. It was a beautiful day for an execution. As I walked along the gravel path, the crunch of my footsteps sounded unnaturally loud, like a funeral procession for one. I saw him from a distance, waiting on our designated bench. He wasn't the charismatic, confident teacher I had first met, nor the passionate, commanding lover I had known in secret. The man waiting for me looked tired, diminished, the vibrant energy I had found so captivating now muted. His shoulders slumped, with a weariness that seemed to go soul deep. Lily had been right. His eyes were heavy. I sat on the other end of the bench, leaving a careful, deliberate 3 feet of empty space between us. It was a chasm. He didn't try to bridge it. For a long time, we just sat in silence, watching the wind send showers of golden leaves dancing to the ground. It's cold, he finally said, his voice quiet. Yes, I replied. The seasons are changing. The pathetic fallacy of it all was almost too much to bear. I turned to him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Julian, I began, my voice surprisingly steady. I can't do this anymore. The words hung in the crisp air between us, simple, brutal, and final. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on some distant point across the river. I know, he said softly. I had expected him to argue, to fight for us, to rekindle the flame with his words. But there was no fight left in him. There was only a profound, heartbreaking resignation. It's not just the lies, I continued, needing him to understand the full scope of my decision. It's the damage, the fallout. I told him about Lily, about her innocent concern over his sadness, and I watched his face crumple slightly at the mention of her name. When she said your name, in our kitchen, it was like a bucket of ice water, our worlds. They were never separate, were they? I just pretended they were. This thing we have, it's not contained. It's seeping out. It's affecting you in a way that my own child can see. I took a shaky breath and then I told him about Mark. I didn't share the details, only the essence of it. He knows something is wrong, I said. He thinks I'm sick or depressed. He confronted me, not with anger, but with kindness, Julian, with love. And it was the cruelest thing he could have possibly done, because it made me see what I've become. The person I am with you is exciting and alive, but the person I have to be to make that happen, she's a monster. She's a liar and a thief, and she's destroying a good man who doesn't deserve any of this. Tears were finally welling in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. What we built here, I said, my voice thick with unshed grief. It was a beautiful fantasy. In that motel room, I felt more alive than I have in a decade. You woke me up. You made me feel seen. But it's not real. It's a bubble. And the price of living in that bubble is the destruction of everything real in our lives. It's too high. It's just too high. He was quiet for a long time, his hands clasped between his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with a pain he was no longer trying to hide. You were never the monster, Eleanor, he said, turning to look at me, his eyes filled with a devastating clarity. You were the reprieve, the only real thing in my life. He finally gave me the confession I had so desperately needed. Lily was right. I have been unwell. Every time I left you, every time I had to go back to my own life, to my own quiet, empty house, the silence was deafening. You didn't make me sad. You made me feel a happiness so intense that the return to my real life was unbearable. The sadness wasn't from the affair. It was from the knowledge that the affair was all we would ever have. I was grieving us long before we were over. His words were a final, heartbreaking gift. He was giving me an absolution I didn't deserve, taking the blame for a sadness I had helped create. He was letting me go. We stood up, the conversation finished. The purpose of our meeting was fulfilled. All that was left was the tearing apart. The air between us vibrated with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken goodbyes. He took a half step toward me, his hand lifting slightly, an instinctive, aborted gesture to reach out, to touch me one last time. I saw the desperate longing in his eyes, a mirror of my own. Every cell in my body screamed to fall into his arms, to breathe him in one last time, but I couldn't. A final touch would be a lie, a promise of something that was now impossible. I took a small, deliberate step back. The movement was barely perceptible, but it was a definitive, final rejection. The hurt that flashed in his eyes was a wound I knew I would carry forever. "Goodbye, Julian," I whispered, the words tasting like grief and freedom all at once. "Goodbye, Eleanor," he replied, his voice breaking on my name, and then we turned. We turned and walked in opposite directions. I focused on the gravel path in front of me, on the rhythm of my own breathing, on putting one foot in front of the other. I did not look back. To look back would be to turn to salt. With every step, I could feel the vast, aching void opening up inside me where he used to be. The addiction was broken, and the withdrawal was an agony that touched every part of my soul. The fever was gone. The beautiful, ruinous story of us was over, and I was left alone, walking back toward a life I had nearly destroyed, with nothing but the cold, heavy, and undeniable burden of my own choices. A year has passed. The seasons have turned, and the violent, vibrant colors of my affair have long since faded, leaving behind the quiet, muted tones of my real life. The house is no longer a stage for my deception, but it is not the sanctuary it once was. It is simply a place I inhabit. Mark and I have found a new, careful rhythm. The wall of lies I built is gone, but its foundations remain in the form of unspoken truths, of questions he learned not to ask. We are not unhappy. We are simply settled. We are two people coexisting peacefully in the shared history of a life that was almost shattered, but wasn't. On the surface, everything is normal. I am the woman I was always supposed to be, a devoted wife, a loving mother. But in the dead of night, when the silence of the house is absolute, I know that a vital part of me is in a permanent, silent exile. Lily's high school graduation was held in the cavernous, sun-drenched auditorium, the same room that had once hosted the fundraiser, where my life had irrevocably split in two. The air buzzed with the collective energy of parental pride, the scent of corsages, and the bittersweet finality of endings and beginnings. I sat between Mark and Lily's grandparents, a perfect portrait of a proud, intact family. When Lily's name was called, a genuine, fierce wave of love washed over me, so pure and powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I watched my daughter, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, walk across the stage to receive her diploma, her future a bright, unwritten page. In that moment, I felt a surge of validation. This was why I had done it. This perfect, untarnished moment was the fruit of my terrible, necessary choice. As the applause for Lily faded, my eyes drifted, almost against my will, to the rows of faculty seated on the stage. My breath caught in my throat. There he was, Julian. A year had etched new, subtle lines around his eyes. He looked thinner, perhaps, and the fiery intellectual passion in his expression had been replaced by a quiet, weary resignation. He was just another teacher in a sea of academic robes, but to me, he was the sole occupant of the room. He was a ghost from a life I had lived in secret, and the sight of him was a physical blow, an invisible hand squeezing the air from my lungs. As if he could feel the weight of my stare across the crowded space, he looked up. His eyes scanned the audience, a detached, sweeping glance, and then they stopped. They found mine. In that instant, the entire auditorium, with its roaring applause and shifting bodies and bright lights, dissolved into a silent, muffled blur. All that existed was the taut, invisible line connecting his eyes to mine. It was a look that lasted no more than 3 seconds, but it contained our entire story. There was no anger, no accusation. There was only a profound, bottomless recognition. I saw in his eyes the memory of his apartment, the feel of the cheap motel sheets, the sound of my name on his lips. I saw a shared, permanent grief for the beautiful, impossible thing we had created and then been forced to kill. His gaze was a question. Did we survive it? And my own was the answer. Yes, but look at the cost. I was the one who broke the connection. I had to. I tore my eyes away and focused on the stage, on my daughter who was now smiling and waving from her seat. I became a mother again. The moment was over. The ghost had vanished back into the crowd, but my heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A phantom limb ached with the memory of his touch, a memory my body had held on to even after my mind had tried so hard to let it go. The rest of the day passed in a dreamlike sequence of celebrations. There were hugs, photographs, a loud family dinner at our favorite restaurant. I smiled, I laughed, I played my part to perfection. I was the gracious hostess, the proud mother, the contented wife. I moved through the joyous chaos like a flawless actress, while my soul was still back in that auditorium, trapped in a 3-second glance with a man I could never speak to again. Later that night, after the celebrations were over and the house had fallen quiet, I stood alone in the living room. Mark was asleep. Lily was out with her friends, celebrating her bright new future. I looked at the photos on the mantelpiece, our wedding, Lily's first steps, a dozen frozen moments of a happy life. I had done the right thing. I had saved this. I had protected my daughter from the shrapnel of my own selfishness. I had preserved the quiet, steady love of a good man. I had everything a woman is supposed to want. But as I stood there in the darkness, the ghost returned. I thought of Julian, of the resigned sadness in his eyes. I thought of the passion we had shared, a passion so intense it felt like the sun, a force that could both illuminate and incinerate. I had chosen the cool, safe, predictable shade. I had made my choice, and I would live with it every day for the rest of my life. The woman who had come alive in Julian's arms, who had felt so exquisitely seen and desired, she hadn't died on that autumn day in the park. She had simply been led to a quiet room in the back of my soul and locked away forever. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear her rattling the door. I have a good life. I have a safe life. But I will walk through the rest of it, haunted by the brilliant, blinding color of a world I was allowed to touch but never to inhabit. And I will always wonder not if I survived, but what part of me had to die in order to do so.